establishing central control immediately. This pawn stake opens lines for development and pressures black's potential queenside space. Developing the knight to its most natural square, f6, immediately contests the center and prepares for kingside castling. Stealing central space, white immediately challenges black's flexible knight. Setting up a fianchetto, black seeks long-term diagonal influence over the queenside, a common response to white's territorial ambitions. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies control of the d5 square and prepares for a potential kingside attack. Immediately challenging the center with d5 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for active pieces. Solidifying the center and preparing to castle, this development gracefully supports the central pawn structure. Developing the bishop to g7 anchors the fianchetto and reinforces the central dark squares, preparing for potential pawn breaks. Developing the bishop to this active square immediately challenges black's pawn structure and prepares for central expansion. Solidifying the central pawn structure, this move prepares for further queenside expansion and challenges white's immediate kingside initiative. Solidifying the center and preparing a kingside fianchetto, this move calmly fortifies white's central presence. Securing the monarch in the king's Indian setup initiates a crucial phase of development, preparing to contest central space. Shielding the king and preventing future bishop intrusions on the dark squares creates a solid defensive foundation. Solidifying the center's pawn structure, this retreat wisely protects the knight and prepares for future pawn pushes. Unleashing pressure on the queenside pawn structure, this queen maneuver eyes potential infiltration and targets weaknesses created by black's pawn distribution. A bold pawn sacrifice, liberating the queen and forcing white to reconsider their central ambitions, potentially opening lines for counterplay. Capturing the pawn opens lines and resolves central tension, setting the stage for a sharp, dynamic struggle. Trading off the bishop on c4 immediately simplifies the position, aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn opens a diagonal for the queen and aims to exploit the isolated queen's pawn. The queen now eyes the queenside, indirectly pressuring the c4 bishop and seeking better squares. Securing the castled king anchors the position, preparing for central pawn thrusts and piece redeployment. Shifting the queen proactively seeks counterplay, though it might leave it vulnerable to swift central advances. Bolstering the queenside pawn structure, this move prepares to defend against any black incursions while also potentially opening the b-file for future pressure. Asserting queenside presence, this rook repositions to seize an open file and pressure white's vulnerable pawn structure. Asserting control over the open c-file now solidifies white's central grip and puts pressure on black's queenside. Reorienting the knight to potentially contest the queenside pawn structure and improve its diagonal presence offers intriguing counterplay. Aggressively occupying the d5 outpost, white aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially exploit the undefended c7 pawn. Trading queens here concedes important central influence, potentially leading to a less active endgame for black if white can properly exploit the open lines. The rook now dominates an open file, a significant asset for kingside pressure. Gaining a foothold for the king, but the queenside remains underdeveloped. A bold knight advance, striking deep into black's camp and aiming for the queen's retreat path, a classic tactical probe. Breaching the pawn chain opens avenues for the queen and counterplay on the open c-file. Securing the rook is a tactical coup, but abandoning the central e-file opens doors for black's knights. Black sacrifices the knight to break the pawn chain and activate the rooks, aiming for counterplay on the open c-file. Asserting control over the queenside by pinning down black's weak pawn structure. This move aims to solidify black's queenside pawn structure, but it concedes valuable central space and offers little immediate counterplay. Asserting dominance on the queenside, the rook ventures to raid black's queenside pawns. Controlling the queenside and securing a foothold for your knight on the open file provides crucial queenside counterplay. Snatching the pawn simplifies, but it allows black's rooks to activate on the open files. Pushing the pawn opens lines and aims to free the stranded knight, but it also weakens the queenside pawn structure. The rook's repositioning aims to reclaim initiative on the queenside and potentially target the vulnerable pawn structure. Repositioning the bishop to f6 aims to solidify the pawn chain and potentially activate it on the kingside, a subtle but important positional adjustment. Bolstering the queenside advance, this pawn push aims to solidify white's territorial gains and restrict black's bishop. Solidifying the bishop's retreat, this regrouping aims to fortify the kingside against white's pervasive queenside pressure. Asserting control over the queenside, this advance prepares to challenge black's isolated pawns and solidify white's pawn majority. Reclaiming the knight's central influence frees up avenues for piece redistribution. Targeting black's advanced knight frees up the queen and creates a dynamic pressure point. Reclaiming the center and preparing for an active kingside assault seems to be the aim. Repositioning the knight to a more active square prepares to contest the central e-file and exploit potential pawn weaknesses. Reasserting the bishop's influence, this move aims to disrupt white's kingside control and potentially prepare for a central pawn advance. Clearing the knight from its cramped outpost, white looks to redeploy it to a more active square. Reclaiming the piece immediately simplifies the position and alleviates the pressure on black's queenside pawns. Asserting control over the central files, this rook redeployment prepares to contest black's bishop pair. Liberating that bishop from its passive confinement now contests the crucial central squares. This establishes a menacing presence, aiming to squeeze black's queenside pawns and restrict their mobility. Recapturing the bishop reestablishes a pawn chain, but it solidifies white's central control and opens lines for attack. Sacrificing the knight to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain an open file for attack. Reclaiming material, black opens lines for their rook and centralizes the pawn chain, initiating a complex positional fight. A knight's repositioning aims to exploit the weak pawn structure and pressure the queenside. Recapturing the rook on e8 solidifies black's structure, preparing to contest the open e-file with the remaining pieces. Seizing the open file with the knight promises a decisive advantage in the ensuing exchanges. Reclaiming the d-file is paramount, as the rook now anchors the initiative and prepares to contest central control. Securing the e-file now prevents black's rook from becoming overly active on that open avenue. Relocating the bishop to the queenside creates a strong defensive network, anticipating further exchanges. Seizing the initiative on the 7th rank opens a powerful invasion route. King reactivation is crucial, bringing the monarch closer to the pawn action and potential passed pawn defense. Initiating a forceful king hunt, this check exposes vulnerabilities and forces the black monarch into a perilous central position. The king ventures out, seeking activity but exposing itself to checks along the open files. The rook's repositioning creates a potential blockade, hindering black's king's mobility on the queenside. The rook's repositioning creates an immediate threat to the pawn, forcing white to defend actively. Seizing the unprotected knight frees up the rook for active deployment. Unleashing the knight towards the center, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's rook dominance on the flank and potentially contest crucial central squares. Repositioning the knight to patrol key squares, it prepares to potentially disrupt black's pawn structure further. Capturing the knight opens a path for the queen to attack the vulnerable white king, potentially creating tactical complications. Capturing the pawn opens a path for your king to become an active participant in the endgame. Reclaiming material lost earlier, this pawn recapture opens up counterplay while creating a dynamic endgame threat. Reclaiming the flank, this rook advances to contest the important 7th rank and pressure the pawn chain. The black king, exposed and venturing too far, now faces unavoidable material losses. Solidifying the pawn structure opens lines for the rook to rejoin the attack. challenging the knight's advanced outpost, aiming to disrupt white's pieces. Securing the king on the diagonal is a wise precaution against any immediate threats. This maneuver aims to centralize the monarch, preparing to re-enter the fray and support the advanced passed pawn. Bolstering the queenside pawn structure solidifies territorial gains and prepares for a potential rook advance. A bold attempt to win back material, but it leaves the knight vulnerable to white's advanced pawn. Securing the passed pawn's advance with the rook establishes control over the 7th rank, a pivotal step towards a winning endgame. The knight's retreat allows white's rook to penetrate, creating an immediate tactical threat against the king. Advancing this pawn offers a pathway for your rook to join the attack on the queenside. Focusing the knight on the weak queenside pawns offers black a chance to consolidate. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank immediately targets the isolated pawn and prepares to disrupt black's endgame aspirations. Repositioning the king to g6 offers better protection and potentially prepares to advance the rook. Initiating a pawn thrust to outflank and pressure the enemy rook and its supporting knight. The knight repositions to potentially either queenside pawns or retreat to a more active square. Repositioning the knight to attack the d-pawn opens up aggressive possibilities. The king's trek to the queenside appears precarious given the active rook. A tactical retreat, repositioning the knight to either queenside pawns while offering a potential exchange to simplify. The knight's new outpost on e4 poses a significant threat to black's weakened queenside pawn structure. Unleashing a timely knight fork, this aggressive maneuver aims to exploit the exposed black monarch and regain material advantage.